Welcome to the Extinction Level Event Podcast, Apocalypse Edition. I am your host, the Barrelman. We're going to be talking about genetic diversity as its own topic, not specifically how it relates to the nuclear warfare issue, but there's definitely some overlap there. Okay, so the first topic we're going to get to, kind of right off the top, is science deniers. Now, I know we've gone over this kind of thing before a few times on here. I've seen a few YouTube episodes lately dealing specifically with this topic, and one guy specifically, I think it is Professor Dave. He's done a bunch of videos specifically addressing flat earth denialism, and I was watching another one talking about from somebody, no, it was actually him. He was talking about anti-intellectualism. But there are a few other YouTubers I don't recall. I guess I looked one thing up one time, and now all this stuff is just popping up, which is fine. I don't mind watching these things and hearing people's opinions and everything. The only problem I have is that now I'm getting all this information that's probably been on there for years, as if it, is brand new. It's new to me, but it's not new information. So it's a little misleading in the thought of, oh, this is an issue right now, just because these particular videos are coming up. But then you switch over to the news and realize, oh yeah, this is definitely an issue right now. So we're not going to be long on this topic, because like I said, I've talked about this before. But I just want to highlight a few things before we get going, because this whole anti-intellectual science denying thing is such a trend at the moment. That science is merely collecting data from observation. And it sounds all dry and like, well, that's not what I do. I live my life. I don't collect data. That's just because it's a very dry way of just being, it's science tries to break things down into understandable segments so that we can then build upon that for more complex ideas. So when they say stuff like, simply collecting data from observation, it sounds really dry and boring, but it's just because it's a more simplified way of saying, I see stuff, therefore I know stuff, which is where most people get what they call common sense, right? Again, we go back to fire hot. This whole thought of, well, if I see stuff and it's true, then it is true. Although that's really not the way reality works, but I mean, you can understand where that comes from. It's not 100% not true. It's just that there's a lot of mitigating factors and things that you may not be controlling for or completely understanding of why something happened the way it did in that particular instance. That makes it that particular thing isn't just always true. And the thing that you think is true may not actually be the true thing you got out of that. I know it's a big, weird word jumble to basically say, what you saw is what you saw, but what you got out of it isn't necessarily what you thought, right? The thing you're saying that's true might not actually be the true thing that happened, even though the instance that happened is the true thing it's a runaround circular logic kind of a thing, but it's just the way the world works. You walk around and realize you're not bouncing off of the planet and falling into space. When you take a step, you probably don't even leave the ground before you take your next step, right? You're not like taking a step and bouncing like on the moon. So you're constantly gathering data, even just from something like walking, because you're understanding how walking works. You understand how object permanence works at some point. You understand how pushing on something moves it, right? These are all very basic things in which there's a lot of, like I said, truth underneath the thing you're seeing that's really the truth you're not really understanding while you're doing it, even though obviously the thing you're doing is happening. The fact of the matter is, this is how science is done. And the big difference between you just living your day-to-day life and quote-unquote science is that they usually try to control for every variable that they can to make sure that the data they receive is as correct as possible. So while you may push a drink across a counter a few times and go, yeah, okay, and then somehow somebody accidentally put a little water on there. They spilled a drink or something that's just, maybe it's actually water, so you don't really see it, or maybe it's a dark soda, but it's a dark counter. And you push the cup that you've always pushed, and now all of a sudden it flies right off because the liquid lubricant on the surface has now made it slippery. And the cup that you could normally just push right over to the edge because you just got so good at this after, years or whatever doing it, now all of a sudden flies right off and breaks the cup. And it's like, oh, wait, what the hell? So what happened was a variable, something that you didn't control for, something that you didn't think about, something you probably didn't even notice has come in and changed the circumstances of the thing that you had done. So science tries to eliminate those sort of guesswork. Oh, what if this happens? Oh, crap, that ruined everything. Even though they certainly can't. It's certainly not all the time. So things like that will still be a part of it. And that's why repeating experiments over and over is so important. So we can do the thing over and over to really understand how it works and not just, hey, I'll do it a few times. Oh, this seems to be the way that it works. And that's really why we have things like double-blind peer-reviewed studies, so that these things can be done by a lot of people and always, always, always repeat the same results. What I am trying to do is that if you look at a model, like, say, TikTok or Instagram or shorts on YouTube, or even not just a short, but those can be particularly helpful because you can do a quick thing and see if you get the result for that quick thing that everybody else does. If you push the drink across the table, if they push a drink, all of a sudden you're getting tons and tons of people feeding in data from doing that one thing. You could really come across some very cool, understanding and parse through some data that maybe wasn't even necessarily intentional. So things like that can really contribute to our understanding of things. And that very process, other than the fact that they usually don't control for variables in most of those cases, it's still a very good example of at least the basic concept of the scientific process. So every time you go and you see people repeating something over and over again, especially anybody who can gain information from that number of instances of something happen in varying different degrees and in situations, to get some sort of, this is true and this seems to be true and this seems to be true of most, if not all, of these things, and what does that tell us about what's going on? And I don't necessarily mean you have to do it in a scientific way. After all, you could look at 50 dresses that people are looking at and say, okay, this looks like it's kind of the trend of things that people want to wear. And what are the trends? Where were the trends? Where are the trends headed? This is, in fact, a scientific methodology for gathering data. And even if what you're doing is more of a subjective, I think this might be where fashion is going, it is still a scientific method of gathering data, coming up with a hypothesis, and then going and seeing if your hypothesis is true. Science is in everything, every time you do stuff. So whenever people say science, they think of someone in a lab coat with chemicals. That is a specific type of science that it in and of itself is not science. So, okay, that's just our first little topic. I know it took a little bit to get through, but it's kind of important. It just is very frustrating when I see all these science deniers. And I know that they do science on a daily basis. They just don't think of it like that. And therefore, science is dumb and everybody is stupid and science is a religion. And it's like, science is just a process. It's not an answer. It doesn't have an answer. It doesn't know any answers. Science is just a process of which we try to obtain information. And what we do with that information is up to the individual of how we try to look at it and get truth or understanding out of that information. So the gathering of information is really what science is. And there are people online all the time feeding each other misinformation. But the fact of the matter is you're still trying to get information, even if that information is false. So you're still doing a type of science. You're looking into things, trying to gather information. Whether the information is the world is flat, whether the information is nobody knows what they're talking about because Trump is the greatest hero of all time, whether it's Kamala Harris had the election stolen from her, or we're all going to turn into mole people in the next 10 years and live underground. But not just because we live underground. We're actually turning into mole people. Like, there's going to be some sort of Bill Gates-inspired virus that is going to turn people into mole people because he thinks that's how everybody's going to survive or something, which is not a thing. Certainly not a thing I believe. And I don't think anybody's ever said that. They could have. I don't know. People say crazy stuff all the time. The point is, gathering information, trying to find sources, even if it's just one that you always listen to. The fact is, if you watch something like, say, Fox News has many programs, even if they're all saying the same thing. So even though it's a terrible way to try to gather and reinforce information, to just listen to this one media station that's just always giving you the same information because everybody's told to, not because everybody's such an independent, go-getter that they all come up with the same thing. Still, the fact is, you're trying to get information. Everybody there is reinforcing a particular piece of information. It's a type of information gathering. So yes, that is a scientific endeavor you've just, gone into. So I hate to break it to all the science deniers. They do science on a daily basis, whether they think so or not. Okay, let's move on. So I've looked up a few things for our topic today. There's a person on Reddit. I'll tell you who it is and what day and all that stuff, but I'm just letting you know that it's from Reddit, that I think brought a lot of information, seems to know what they're talking about. I don't know who they are. Like, I know their moniker on Reddit, and I'll tell it to you, but I have no idea who this person is. If they're a scientist, if they're Joe Blow, if they're postdoctorate, or if there's somebody who just, likes the subject and looks up a lot of information and just has it. Either way, this person has this really nice entry about this precise thing. Apparently, and he cites things that when I looked up the subject and tried to get information on at least a couple of different occasions, maybe more, I came up with bupkis for anything of any real value. Anything more than people saying, well, I think, and you never really know, and blah, blah, and just telling us all the stuff that they don't know and understand instead of giving me something that maybe we do know and understand. That's not what I'm looking for. I want the actual framework and idea to work with to try to come up with something that is a way to understand. Anyways, so I looked this up as much as I could, and really that's all I found was this isn't the way, and this is, we don't know, and nobody really has the answers. And it's like, somebody has some answers. I'm just looking for what they are, a basic framework. This guy lays it all out pretty well. Again, he cites some sources that I didn't find when I was looking, and I don't mean because they didn't exist. I mean, whatever queries I was giving, it wasn't giving me the answers of, hey, look more into these guys because they know what they're talking about. Otherwise, I would have done that. And this person lays those out as well, which is really nice. So I'm just going to read this person's statement until the end, which is just their conclusion. I think there's a little bit in the conclusion that might be worth saying, but most of it's just, so in conclusion, all the stuff I just said. So I'm going to read this. It's from Reddit again. What's the subreddit? Ask Science, it looks like, is the subreddit. And this is someone called Taxidea, or Taxidia, however they want to pronounce it. I do not know. I don't know anything about them. This was 13 years ago that they put this up, which is great. Thanks for telling me now when I've already spent years looking something like this up. But hey, better late than never, right? So the question was asked. This person goes a little bit more into it in their statement. I'm just going to ask the question because that's the important part. What is the smallest population that can successfully restart a species? So, now we get in, that's the question. That wasn't this person. Now we get in the Taxidea or Taxidea or whatever this person's name is. It's Taxidea. All right? Again, this was 13 years ago. Who knows if this person's even on anymore? But It depends on the species as well as several other factors, luck included. And this is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 paragraphs, not including the conclusion, which I think there's like one little sentence I'll read. One of them's a decent sized paragraph. But I'm going to read through it because I think there's a lot of good information in here, and then we will work from there. All right. Obviously, ask science and look up whatever the question is, the smallest population that can successfully restart a species. If you want to see this for yourself, it'll probably come up. It depends on the species as well as several other factors, luck included. Theoretically, a population could be started with just a gravid female with no ill effects. It's pregnant, for those who don't understand. The only reason I really know that is because I watch a lot of herpetology videos, and they talk about gravid females all the time. If by chance ALES, or ALS, it's ALLELES, ALS. If by chance those aren't fixed, then this population would have nearly as much genetic diversity as a huge population. Of course, this isn't likely to happen, and negative ALS usually become fixed in the population. Now, I had no idea what the hell this was, so I looked it up. So I'll just read what I found. It says, it doesn't say how to pronounce it, and ALS, I'm sure the Wikipedia does, but I'm not looking that up at the moment, is a variant of gene or a different version of a DNA sequence at a specific location on a chromosome. If by chance the ALS or whatever are fixed, in other words, they're this good, healthy population, and they're not really unstable, they're not apt to change easily, then the population would have nearly as much genetic diversity as a huge population. Of course, this isn't likely to happen, and negative ALS usually become fixed in a small population. So it's saying if they aren't fixed, if they can change to adapt and to grow and to learn how to survive better in whatever environment you find yourself in, you have a good chance, because that is genetic diversity, those little mutations and changes. He's saying if they aren't fixed, or if they are, and they do not change, then most likely you probably don't have the healthiest, best genes of all human beings ever to, have existed, even if you're a generally healthy person. The rule of thumb, which I believe was invented by Michael Solé, the godfather of conservation biology, is the 50/500 rule. That is, for the short-term avoidance of inbreeding depression, you need an effective population the size of 50 individuals and 500 for long-term genetic viability. This is only a rule of thumb and should not be overused. For example, the effective population size of passenger pigeons likely needed to be much higher than 50 for short-term or 500 for long-term. Someone previously mentioned minimum viable population, a concept related to this that conservation biology thankfully seems to be moving away from. Minimum viable population was first used by Mark Schaefer in 1999 and defined as the smallest isolated population having a 99% chance of remaining extant for 1,000 years, despite the foreseeable effects of demographic, environmental, and genetic stochasticity, and I don't know that word, and natural catastrophes. I believe Schaefer first used MVP with grizzly bears in Yellowstone. He preached, interesting way of putting it, caution and viability, but MVP is still a largely arrogant concept, putting certainty on something we're inherently uncertain about. On a personal note, I particularly like saying that this is the number of grizzly bears we need, so the rest are just surplus. Population viability analysis is largely the same concept, but much more flexible and less certain. As you seem to understand from your question, the small population can enter an extinction vortex where they cannot recover. This is not due only to dangerous effects of genetic drift on small populations, but also environmental and demographic stochasticity or stochasticity. I don't know how to pronounce it. I'm sure if I heard it, I'd be like, oh yeah, I have heard that before. In short, a small population is in danger of producing all male or female offspring one year, having no mating opportunities, or having an environmental disaster destroy the entire population among other threats. So we got one more paragraph to go, and then that little soundbite from the other one. There are several examples of small populations doing seemingly just fine. How many wolves in total were released in Idaho and Yellowstone? It was under 30, I believe. Not all of those were part of the effective population size. And now, the several thousand in the lower 48 are doing better than anyone could have expected, with no apparent negative genetic effects. Pierre David's deer lives in capacity, but descended entirely from 11 individuals. Inbreeding depression doesn't appear to be a problem with them either. So there we go. That's the article. And I think it really is saying a lot in that, especially as far as giving us a framework of numbers to look at. I don't know what the 5,500 thing is. I know people are going to say, well, it just said it. What I mean is, why would we look at something in the short term? I don't understand, unless, I guess there could be an argument for, say, if we had a population that we needed to send to, say, Mars, and they were going to be gone for 5-10 years, that small population doesn't need to survive for long periods of time, but they still need to have enough genetic diversity that, well, say it's not 5-10 years, let's say it's 2 generations. Let's say it's 60 years they're going to be up there. A couple of generations. They're free to breed or not breed. It's up to them. But, we expect there will be population increase, essentially. The 50 people isn't enough to then populate Mars. But it is enough to keep their population diverse enough so that when they do return, because that's part of the plan for this specific example I'm giving, that then when they join the rest of the population, that's at least 500 or more, or 450 or whatever, because we talk about the 50 rule, whatever the population grows into, that it contributes to that 500 number for long term. In that sort of situation, yes, I can understand why there would be a 5,500 rule, but for the most part, I don't know why the 50 is even part of the discussion. Every population we're talking about, we want long term. We don't want short term. So that's why I'm saying maybe this other situation is what they're talking about and why that exists. Otherwise, it seems like the 500 is really what we're talking about, because we want the, the species to continue. Now, I suppose in, say, a nuclear explosion kind of a situation where most of the people are dead and all the population centers are gone, we're looking at maybe patches of people less than 50, right? And if you can try to cobble together 50 people, the understanding being that there is at least 500 people alive still, you just have to get enough of them together in one place to boost the genetic diversity and advance that population. And you're thinking that we just need to have this short-term population diverse as possible until we can get to enough people to actually make the 500 work. I guess in that situation that might work as well. But for the most part, those are very specific, circumstances. Usually when you come up with a rule like that, you're not really making a rule for every little teeny little specific circumstance. You're trying to generally answer a specific question. Like, what's the smallest population that you can have genetic diversity to save a species, essentially? So why you would have both those numbers, I'm not sure. But there you are. So maybe it is because of those specific circumstances. So let's see what the rest of these notes are so I can do them in the correct order. Okay, so this is this is kind of an important basis because we are talking about the human race here, and we are talking about the survival of our species in a hopefully preventing a doomsday scenario, right? By having enough genetic diversity that we can continue our species even under the harshest of circumstances. Having said that, our species isn't the only important one on planet Earth. So we need to talk about species and animals in general and how they're doing and if being affected, because that will also affect us. And for anybody out there who's raising their hand and saying, I don't need animals, that's not going to affect me, you have literally no idea what you're talking about. So let's get into this. We're not going to get into what I just talked about because that's a whole different podcast of trying to get into why animals are necessary. I think a lot of people are going to understand that they are, especially understanding that bees are animals. People say, but they're insects. Yes, insects are animals. And we're going to talk now a little bit about the food web, right? Because we learn about predator, prey, which then builds food chains, right? And now this is kind of the ultimate expression of that. It's the food web. When we open it up to all sorts of animals, we learn that there are connections between all of these things, and these chains aren't just up and down straight lines, but they go diagonally and they intercross and all that kind of thing. So the food web is really the best way, even though it's a simplification of the natural order, to look at things to really get a better understanding. So this is something that's called, it's from Libre Texts Biology, or bio.libretext.org is where I found this. It's called, maybe that's the name of, I don't know what the name of the book is. It doesn't say. This is just, I think, chapter 9.2 or whatever, Quantifying Food Webs. So there's just a few topics here that I think is important for understanding the importance of a food web in general. So here's something called the 10% law. The 10% law of transfer of energy from one tropic level to the next can be attributed to, talking about who came up with it. Not that it's not important, it's just, limited time, and I don't have time to call out every single reference right now. This is all online for you to look at on your own. I suggest anybody who's interested definitely do that. All right. Law cited transfer efficiencies ranging from 0.1% to 37.5%, according to the law, during the transfer of organic food energy from one tropic level to the next higher level. Only about 10% of the transferred energy is stored as flesh. The remainder is lost during transfer, broken down in respiration, or lost to incomplete digestion or higher tropic level. Okay, so I was actually looking at it the other way around, but okay. That was kind of dumb. Obviously, this is the correct way to look at it, which only makes sense. So every time a predator eats its prey, it's only gaining about 10% of the energy that prey actually has in total, which kind of makes sense, and they're laying it out there kind of why. And so you have to look at the entire biomass of the bottom level and the, what do they call it? The trophic level, basically where you are in the food chain. And then when we start making it more complex of the food web, you'll see that these parts of the chain start to overlap with other parts of the chain. So, for example, if we just go from the top and we say apex predators, all apex predators are on the same trophic level of the food web. Now, you might think, well, a bald eagle is an apex predator, but it's not the same as a bear. Like, you can't just put those equal. This isn't death match. You don't put in, two animals enter, one leave. We're just talking about the hierarchy in the ecosystem, not about what animal can beat another animal. This isn't whether an eagle can beat a bear or whether a bear's ever eaten an eagle before. We're talking about the standard protocols within a particular food environment. Eagles are apex predators. With the with exceptions that can happen due to whatever exceptional circumstances, right? Like, for example, let's say people stuck in the woods, right, trying to survive, have liftoff of things like worms and frogs and stuff like that, right? And these aren't things that normally people eat, especially raw. Some of them can be quite toxic and deadly. But we've definitely seen this happen when people are trying to survive in the woods. They get lost and they start eating whatever it is they have on hand. Unfortunately, sometimes that's poisonous stuff, not just animals, but it could be berries and stuff that'll just murder the hell out of you. So we see this as an exception. This is not people are right above worms and frogs on the food chain. We're way the hell up there, right? We are definitely apex predators. And we definitely eat the things that then eat the things that then eat the things, right? And finally get down to worms. So there are exceptions that does not place us in the same category as those who eat worms and frogs. We have our category, but there are definitely always exceptions. So saying something like, I've seen such and such eat an eagle, does not make eagles not apex predators. The fact is, eagles sit on the top of the apex predators because they don't have standard predators that go after them specifically. In most cases, there are obviously exceptions. It depends on the ecosystem, but there are definitely places in the ecosystems, most places, where eagles are going to be apex predators. Bears are going to be apex predators. Orcas are definitely going to be apex predators. Like, these things don't really have things that normally prey on them. And so they're all combined together in this trophic level. The apex predators are what they're calling a trophic level. So then there's their prey, things that have very few predators. The only predators they have are the apex predators. So for the most part, they are sort of sub-apex predators because they mostly don't have predators, and the apex predators are few and far between because that's just the way numbers work in the food web. So they really kind of rule the roost, if you will, unless they run into that occasional actual apex predator that might pick them off. But aside from that, they're pretty much dominant and in charge as well. And then that's another trophic level right under the apex predators, and then you go down from there. And this is so they're talking about the 10% law, where if you start at the bottommost trophic level, which is not like they keep showing pyramids, but the truth is that these chains have different lengths. If you look at a chain as in, okay, so the eagle eats this, and then that eats this, and then that, you can get smaller and smaller and smaller, and that chain can be extremely long, or the chain can be actually really short, right? This eats this eats that, and that's it. Like, that's kind of the bottom of the chain. So these chains can be longer and smaller, so that trophic level isn't necessarily equal on the bottom like a pyramid, where you have everything that's on this level, but you also have this much on the apex predator level, where if we, depending on whether you go from the bottom or the top, you either have a pyramid that's just weird, jaggedy, like a sawtooth, because the apex predators just, they, cap out at certain levels, and other ones are higher and other ones are lower, or you start at the apex level and work your way down, in which case you're going to get like jaggities on the bottom. So either way, an actual pyramid is really not the best way to kind of look at this. All right, so this is kind of what we're talking about here, and that's food chain length. A common metric used for quantifying food web trophic structure is food chain length. Food chain length is another way of describing food webs as a measure of the number of species encountered as energy or nutrients move from the plants to the top predators. In its simplest form, the length of a chain is the number of links between a trophic consumer and the base of the web, or the maximum trophic level of a species in that food web. The diversity we're talking about is that an eagle might eat, say, a rodent, like a field mouse, let's say, but it'll also eat a fish. But it'll also eat a snake, but it'll, you know what I mean? So these different animals that it eats could be in independent food chains that The fish's top predator isn't necessarily the eagle. Eagles probably eat fish, but they don't eat them very often. They're a little bit hard to catch, and usually they're a little bit deeper in the water than the eagles can get. So eagles eat them, but maybe it's not their main diet. Now, I'm not saying that that's a rule for eagles. What I'm saying is, in a particular environment, an eagle may pick off a fish every once in a while, but that might not be their main thing. They might pick off more rodents. So the top predator for this fish isn't eagles. Maybe it's bears. Maybe it's a larger fish. Maybe there's a top predator up there. Maybe it's a fox. That's the thing that normally takes out the majority of the fish. That's the apex predator. But there is crossover where this eagle also will take it. So now there's a connection between these two supposedly independent food chains, if you look at them that way. That, of course, is why there's a food web. But the more connections you have, especially the lower you get, the healthier that this ecosystem is. So if you have an animal that can only eat this one thing and it's near the bottom of the food chain and there's a ton of it, you're really dependent on that one thing to do its job to keep the population of that hugely abundant thing in check. Whereas if you have 2 or 3 things that also feed off of that, and this food web is expanded and there's these connections between what is essentially these independent chains. Now, obviously they're not independent, but in the way of looking at it, you could pull these apart into these different chains, even though they're really together in the web. That the more connections you have between there, now one population decreasing due to a disease or weather event or something doesn't destroy that entire pyramid and put everything in danger, because there are other animals that now pick up the slack, in that one that fell short and its population increase will probably come back. But in the meanwhile, you have more things picking up its slack. So the variety of things that cross over, that connect within this food web, is another sign of a healthy food web. So now, what was this? Okay, so I was looking up what the drawbacks of having a smaller genetic pool is, or less genetic diversity. So let's look at the key drawbacks of a small genetic pool real quick. When closely related individuals mate, harmful recessive genes are more likely to be expressed, leading to weaker offspring with decreased fitness. With limited genetic variation, a population is less equipped to adapt to changing environment conditions, making them vulnerable to new threats. Random fluctuations in the ELE, remember we were talking about that in the little mutations and changes within the genetic structure, within the frequencies, can lead to the loss of beneficial genes in small populations, further reducing genetic diversity. Now, obviously, you can have some people, like, for example, lose the ability to digest lactose, and that's okay. It doesn't kill the ability to digest lactose for everybody, because you have enough people who still have that gene, that even if those genes aren't being expressed by some, you still have enough people that do have the gene to do it, that it won't kill that ability in everybody. You'll still have enough people. And if that becomes dominant, because that's what everybody has left to eat, either you process it correctly and live, or you die, that can be an important thing to pass on. And what this is saying is the less people you have passing on good genes, if you lose those, they're just gone. Now you don't have that recovery population to come back and add those genes back in. If a disease emerges that targets a specific genetic trait, a population with low genetic diversity is more likely to be severely affected. Inbreeding can result in reduced fertility and higher rates of embryonic mortality. Many endangered species have small isolated populations, which leads to small gene pools, making them highly vulnerable to extinction. When breeding animals in captivity, the limited genetic diversity, careful management is needed to prevent inbreeding depression. Which sounds like, oh man, I got to do it with my sister. God, I'm depressed. It's depression is, in this case, they're talking about expressed genetic traits. So the difference between having, say, white skin and black skin, those are both genetic traits, and one will be expressed and one will be depressed or not expressed, essentially. And you can have somebody who's got how about somebody who's in between? Yes, but those are still specific genes that are either being expressed or and what they call depressed. So yeah, you can get in between, but there are specific genes that make that happen just as much as they make one or the other happen. It's not one gene that makes you black or one gene that makes you white. It's a host of genes, and they all play into what, melanin happens to be dominant within your skin, what amount it is, what color, that kind of thing. When it's talking about inbreeding depression, it's talking about inbreeding, creating depression. Not that you're being depressed because you're having to do it with your sister. Sorry. I said it too many times. This just became funny. I apologize. Okay. So, and then I looked up what happens when you remove all the apex predators out of an environment, because that kind of thing can happen where you can just take out a chunk of the food chain. In this case, I just wanted a kind of a top-down approach and just say, okay, let's say that the thing that's being taken out is apex predators. And I know this is the kind of thing that we've seen before, because apex predators being the top predators, there's always less of them. There's the least populous trophic of the food chain, because you don't need as many, because they eat, one apex predator can eat like 2 or 3, the lesser predators, the sub-apex predators or whatever, and they will eat 5 or 10 of whatever they're eating. That's why I looked it up. And it says, when you remove apex predators from an ecosystem, it often leads to a significant disruption in the food chain, causing a phenomenon called trophic cascade, where the populations of their prey species dramatically increase, which can then impact the lower levels of the food chain, including vegetation and other animal populations, potentially causing imbalances and ecosystem instability. Essentially, the removal of the top predator can significantly alter the entire ecosystem dynamic. The most immediate effect is a surge in the population of the apex predator's primary prey species, as there's no longer a natural control on their numbers. So if you take out an apex predator, sometimes the things that they were keeping in check are things that will, we were just kind of talking about it. If you say have 10 things and you have things that need to eat 5 each to survive, and you have 2 of them, you got a good balance. And when you have apex predators, maybe they eat, 2 things. So they're above the 2 things that eat the 10 things. When you lose that apex predator who picks off some of those things, so let's say usually you have those 2 things that eat the 10 things. Let's just say if you have 10 fish and they're eaten by 2 wolves, right? And then you have a bear that eats the wolves. This isn't necessarily how the chain would work, but let's just put names on them so it's a little easier to understand when I'm going back and forth through the chain. So let's say you have the 10 fish, the 2 wolves, and the 1 bear. And the wolves have cubs, and they usually have somewhere between, let's say, and I'm not saying this is the way it is, I'm just giving this as an example, 2 to 3 cubs. Well, this environment can only house 2 wolves at a time before it becomes overpopulated. Now, let's just say by the time these cubs grow up and become a problem for this food chain, because while they're around, the food chain's a little bit thinner. They don't survive as well as they did off the 10 things, but it's okay because they're raising the young. But let's say by the time the young get old enough, they can then... The parents are gone, right? They pass on. They don't live long enough to be a problem anymore. Now you have 3 wolves, though. But let's say the bear comes along and he only needs to eat 1 wolf. So he comes along and he eats one of the 3 wolves. Well, now you're in balance again. You've got 2 wolves eating off the 10 fish and the 1 bear, right? So you have balance again. But if you take out the bear, now all of a sudden you have 3 wolves that survive. And especially if, for say, one of the parents dies, but the other one somehow lives an extra long life, now you've got 4 wolves. Now you've got them completely decimating these 10 fish they're no longer able to survive and maintain the population of the 2 wolves that are now 4. So now you have wolves that are starving and dying. You have fish that are just being munched up, so they're not existing anymore. They've, caused an extinction level event for the poor fish. Anything the fish were eating are now going to go rampant, and then you kind of start over again at that level with those things getting out of control from the things above them that were supposed to eat them and keep them in check. And the entire food web can just kind of implode because you took out the apex predators. One apex predator in the system can make an entire ecosystem implode because, especially with one of the things we're talking about, that connectivity. Okay. And the last thing we're going to talk about, one of the first things I wanted to do when I was growing up is be a marine biologist and study sharks. So we're going to talk about sharks specifically here, but they're just an example. A 2022 study published in Nature found that the population of oceanic sharks and rays has decreased by more than 70% since 1970. Now, we're not talking about a shark or a ray. We're talking about all sharks and rays as a family of species. I don't know if it's genus or we're talking phylum. No, we're not phylum. Well, family, genus, species. So I don't know if we're talking about a family or a specific genus. We're not talking about a specific species here. So I don't know where we go to say all sharks and rays. I don't know where that is. But the point is that as a total of whatever it is, the family or the genus, 70% decline in all of them. So that means that some of them could even do better than they had been, but as a whole, there's a 70% decrease, which is even worse because that means some of them have either been wiped out or gotten so close to being wiped out that they're probably not going to be around for much longer. Now, when you look at it like that, it's pretty sad and terrible that most of these creatures are almost gone. But then when you really look at it, you realize, oh crap, these are all different animals within their respective food chains, and together they're part of connected, but sometimes, how should I say? I mean, it's connected, but sometimes they're very loosely connected. Sometimes you could have a food web that's a very sort of isolated food web that does have connections to every other food web, but there's only a few connections because of environmental factors usually, right? It's just in a specific place like the Galapagos, like in Madagascar. Like there's definitely birds that can go back and forth to these places, sea turtle, whatever. There's connectivity there, but it's very light connectivity, but it is still part of the world food web. The reason I'm clarifying that is because these specific sharks that are being, driven to extinction may be the apex predator in a very isolated system, which means their death can collapse that ecosystem a lot more than just the death of a different shark somewhere else. Although the sharks are being apex predators in most circumstances, and yes, I know some things eat sharks, especially other sharks, but they're still usually the apex predator. Remember, an apex predator isn't something that's never ever been eaten or beaten or the world champion wrestling belt shark. They're something that normally has no predators as a standard model of their particular food chain. Does not mean nothing could ever eat them. So, yes, we've seen orcas take out and eat a great white. The great whites are not below orcas on the food chain. They're not normal prey for an orca. So, yes, great whites are at the top of their food chain. Time is running out on my device now, so we're going to call it a day with this particular episode. That's really kind of the stuff I wanted to get out of the way with that one. So, will we survive our own apocalypse? Only time will tell.